This is a podcast celebrating jobs and careers and how and why you might get one of those careers. I'm your host, Frank Stewart, joining you from beautiful Bozeman, Montana. And I'm joined on video by my buddy and co-host Jay Anseth. Hey, Jay.
Hey, Frank.
Also joining us today is our guest and good friend, Dr. Pete Gerges. Among many other distinctions, Pete Gerges is a professor of organismic and evolutionary biology at Harvard University and also an adjunct oceanographer at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He's also a good friend who I've had the pleasure of knowing, I guess, almost 20 years now, Pete. Pete is someone I thought of almost immediately when I conceived of this idea for a podcast for a couple of reasons. He and I talk regularly about our careers, our career trajectories, about students and careers, and I've come to really value his perspective and advice. And secondly, he's just a really interesting guy, one of the most interesting guys I know of, and just a lot of fun to talk with. So welcome, Pete.
Thanks, Frank. Overly generous introduction, but I would expect nothing less. Very kind.
Okay, so Pete, I want to do a little bit more of an introduction to you, but I'm kind of hoping that comes out organically as we go through the conversation here. But I guess one of the first thing I was thinking about was, like, how do I label the hat that gets put on your head?
And so, look, we've known each other a while, and Jay, you and I go way back too. And I don't know that I've ever taken the time, or it's ever come up where, you've asked me, like, who are you? Like, well, I don't mean, but like, what do you do? I mean, I think in some ways, I actually really struggle with this question, to be totally honest with you and everyone listening. Like, we like to put hats on people because it helps us, helps our brains wrap themselves around who a person is. So the fact that, Frank, you called yourself a marine biologist, people bring a lot of baggage with that already. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but it just sort of has these meanings. And like, I've really, really struggled with this because I kind of feel like that the best hat is to actually call me, like, if there's some phrase that conveys the idea of being a teacher and a student at the same time.
Yeah.
I think that's what the hat should really be. And I know it sounds kind of corny, but when I look around at, folks like you two and a lot of folks I know, and I want to be clear here, this isn't just an academic thing. There are a lot of people in my life who have careers all over the place, and they're the kinds of people who are always interested in learning and always interested in teaching. And I don't know that there's one word for that. And maybe maybe that's off target for listeners, like, well, that's not useful. But I am sincere in saying that's a part of how I kind of see myself, is wanting to learn from people that I have the privilege of teaching, and wanting to, frankly, learn from anyone who's willing to teach me.
No, I really value that perspective, and I certainly agree with it, especially when you start thinking about the skill sets that get that get blended together, especially as you really start to advance in your career and you start to recognize what are the attributes that need to come together to make me successful. And this is true for plumbers to scientists, from, politicians to lawyers. There's a variety of different things that makes one good at one's profession. And I think that's really true in academics to a large degree. I mean, we have to balance a lot of different attributes, but I would agree with that. And so maybe it'd be useful, Pete, if you told us a little bit about kind of where you are in your career and how you got there, just to orient folks a little bit more to what you do, who you are.
I think that's great. And I want to, going back to this idea of hats, like I started off with a bit about the hat as sort of sharing with you and the listeners, like, this is how I see myself. So think of it as a kind of identity. But then what I do is kind of different. It sort of falls under that. Like, what is it that I do on a day-to-day basis? And as you said, I'm a marine scientist, and on a day-to-day basis, a lot of what I'm doing is working with people in my lab and people on campus who are also interested in marine science, either because they're pursuing it for a career or they're taking one of the classes I teach. And I believe it's my job to help provide kind of mentoring and collegiality to other scholars of different career stages. Again, this is all sounding very academic, but look at it this way. I think my job as a teacher is to teach what I know and then to tell everybody in the class there's a bunch of stuff that I don't know and there's a bunch of things you can teach me, and really together we're going to co-learn this stuff, right? Because I'm sort of setting the base and you all are going to build on it. So that's a big part of what I do. So as a professor, to be really kind of clear about this, we professors work at different kinds of universities, and those different universities have different expectations of how much teaching we do versus how much fundraising we do / research, right? So I work at a university that doesn't want me to mess up my teaching, but they sure as heck want me to make sure I write lots of grants and do a lot of good science with the money that I get. So I'd say I'd spend maybe about a third of my time in a year teaching in one way, shape, or form. And a lot of times we think that professors are just going in there and delivering lectures and then teaching assistants grade the papers and that's all we do. But to me, real genuine teaching is using a lecture as the beginning of a conversation and then making the time to engage with students, right? So call that about a third of my life. Then I would say the other third of my life is this fundraising that I alluded to, okay? And that means that I'm writing these grants. And for those who may be less familiar with that, that means I identify an agency like the National Science Foundation or even the Office of Naval Research or the Army. And they usually have pots of money where they say, we want someone to look into this thing. We don't exactly know what's going to come out of it, but we know it could be useful and important. So we're going to pay, we're going to put some money on the table. Here's a few $100,000. And if you want to compete for it, you write a grant. And if we like what you say, we'll give you this grant. Or sometimes it's actually a contract. And to distinguish here, folks, a grant is basically saying, we're going to give you some money and you go figure it out. A contract is where, like, the Army might say, we really want someone to think about how to better use titanium poles. I'm being silly, but here's a contract. So we're going to give you more and more money if you really do build titanium poles in this new way that we're excited about. But either way, it's money that goes to the university, not directly to me, to the university. I'm an employee of the university. So then I take that money and I do what I said I would do, right? So that's probably the other third of my time, is that kind of research and mentoring what are called graduate students, typically in the lab, or postdoctoral scientists, right? These are people who are spending most of their time not in the classroom, but in the laboratory doing the bulk of the work. And that final third of my time is generally pretty administrative. And so about a week ago, guys, somebody asked me, how do you describe being what's called a principal investigator or a PI of a lab? And I said, my best analogy is it's like running a franchise. It's like owning a franchise, like a McDonald's. And the reason I said that is because you're part of a brand, right? That's the university. You kind of have to pay them some tax, which in my case is for every dollar I get from a grant, they take 69 cents or so. And that keeps the lights on and polishes the Harvard H and does all of those things that money does. But I say it's like a franchise because I'm running a small business, but I'm part of a bigger brand or a bigger business. So when I know this is a long answer, folks, but when you think about the life of a professor, it is not just diving in submarines, although I've had that privilege. And it sure as heck in my case isn't just teaching, although it is for some. But for faculty like me at these research universities, it's a chunk of teaching, a chunk of research and writing grants, and a chunk of just the administrative paperwork that is needed to keep everything in order, right? Personnel forms and insurance policies and so on.
So unlike both of you, I am not a professor. I do feel like if you were to take an average person off the street, I may be more familiar with what a professor does than just having gone through grad school and interacted with professors. But one thing that you said, Pete, that really struck me is early on when you were talking about. I really liked how you described the importance of learning on your job, and I forgot how you said it. You talked about almost like collaborating with your students and learning how to do these things together. Yep. So as you describe what you do as almost like a business. So to me, right away, it just by necessity almost suggest that there's aspects of your job that you don't enjoy quite as much as other aspects. And so what role or how important do you think that is? So I mean, this might come down to, I am a parent, so I do think I'm starting to try
Right.
to teach myself about things like growth mindsets and,
Right.
and being in a career where I feel like nobody is impervious to feelings of stagnation. So
Right.
so what you said early on really resonated with me with respect to kind of thinking about it as really a learning opportunity and how that might enable you to do things in a more motivated way, and when during the grind, like big picture perspective. I think. Do you think that is an element of what's made you so successful within your career, is kind of taking that that approach to it, that kind of that mindset of really focusing it on a lifelong learning journey as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jay. I'm sincere when I say this. Let's leave success for posterity. Let's let someone else decide how successful I am or not. Um, does it keep me going? Right? Like, do I get up in the morning and feel like, God, this job blows? Or do I get up in the morning and like wake up with renewed enthusiasm? And I'm going to speak to that, Jay, just very quickly. And the answer is, you nailed it, bud. The fact that I get to wake up every morning and I have an opportunity to learn something new is really exciting. Now,
Yeah.
I think about this a lot because I also am a parent, and my kids are like, God, why do I have to learn this stuff? And I was a terrible student, Jay. And I want to make it clear to all the listeners out there that, I mean, when I say I was a terrible student, I'm talking like D's and F's terrible. So don't let the pretty face fool you, right? I mean, like, there was a time where it was really rough because, and here's the fine point of it, to get to your point, Jay, and sum it up, is I was learning without context. I would sit in a classroom as a high schooler and someone's like, here's some geometry. I'm like, I don't know what the hell you do with that. Didn't make sense to me because it didn't have meaning. The best part of being in academia, hands down, in my opinion, is anything that we do gives us a chance to learn something new in a context we care about. I know that's like a mouthful, but like I get to wake up and like, I think the ocean's pretty cool. I love engineering. And so I will meet someone who's 30 years younger than me and they know how to do something I can't, like program an Arduino. I'm a disaster when it comes to programming. I can fix anything. I can get like toasters to fly to riff off of Apollo 11, but like hardware is my jam, but I work with people who know things that I don't. So I get really excited, Jay, because every morning I remind myself like, oh my God, I've got all this administration to do. But the cool news is at some point, someone's going to bring something to me that's like a problem that they know how to solve and I don't. And it teaches us something about the world that frankly, maybe no one else had ever thought of. It's pretty cool.
Right. Yeah, no, I love that. And kind of what you were saying too, putting the successes aside, actually think that's very, very smart as well, because if you're just looking for those accolades, eventually it's going to kind of catch up to you. You're going to burn out.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to sustain what you do. So.
Oh, Jay, I hope you speak to that some more in future episodes. And by the way, speaking of keeping it real, if you hear my kids screaming in the background, I'm sorry about that. They're out there playing basketball in the basement. But no, Jay, a lot of times we chase these dreams of fame and success, especially scientists. Like we're like, oh, I'm going to make this discovery and everyone will remember me. And I'm such a downer in lab meetings because I tell folks like, look, can you name the Nobel Prizes in physiology, the field that we work in? Can you name the last 3?
Right.
And they
Right.
can't. The most
Let alone someone on the
prestigious
street.
prize.
Yeah.
Right, Jay?
Yeah. Or even which journal you get published in. There's a lot of angst around, so it's
Totally true.
I want to get back to Jay's question a little bit and follow up with some specifics because I think it's a really good one. And I think it's also one that really can, if you think about it, motivate people to go into certain careers. What is the potential that I will grow throughout this career? And you've kind of framed it in the context of learning and personal growth. And I think to some degree, scientists learn almost by default in the context of the operation of science. Like science is invested in the goal of learning. So kind of most of your learning, at least in terms of getting deeper knowledge of how the world works, is experiential learning. You are working with people to do research, you are figuring out answers to questions, but there are many other aspects of your job that you alluded to that also require learning and training. And I look at other professions, like my wife works for the federal government, for example, and much of in the investment in the learning experience there is actually very directed. People go through trainings on a regular basis. They learn about new software on a regular basis. They learn about, how to manage groups. And those are also aspects of like learning and building yourself up in a career. And I'm just kind of wondering how that works for you. I mean, I get how the research leads to growth,
Yeah.
personal learning, but what about all these other things that you need to become good at? How did you become good at them? And is there a mechanism built in to make sure that you're successful at learning those aspects?
I think that's a really great question, and I think for those who are listening and watching and thinking about careers in science in some way, shape, or form, maybe you want to be a professor, maybe you want to be a research scientist. I think it's important to remember that this is a job. At the end of the day, it's a job, and it's really hard sometimes to disentangle a person your sense of self-worth from the job, but it really is honestly just a job. And I bring this up for a couple of reasons. One is most of us don't actually get training to do any of the stuff that I mentioned, right? You write some cool papers, right? And so it's like, oh, look, Pete did this thing. He brought these deep sea animals back from the bottom of the ocean, and he actually figured out how to keep them alive on board ship, and he studied them and figured out all this cool stuff and he even told us about how it might matter to biotech. Yay, go Pete. Here's a job. Here are your keys. Good luck. And honestly, like nobody talked to me about how to run a lab. And my first 2 years, I really ran it as though it were a utopia. And I'm embarrassed by this. But the people who worked with me for the first 2 years, I was like, oh no, nobody needs to be I know I'm the PI, but we're all kind of PIs and it'll all be okay. And we're all going to work together. And I had made assumptions about how everyone's interests were aligned with mine. And it really was rough. There were postdocs who were about my age who just did not care for my style. And maybe there was a bit of envy. I don't know. There were undergraduates who had to listen to postdocs say really mean and bad things about me during lunch when I wasn't there. And they picked a fight with them, and they defended me. And it was like they came and told me, and I was like, oh my God, what's going wrong here? Am I even good at this? And I think it's hard to look back with hindsight and say that there was an ideal solution or not. But what I will tell you is it is a job. And I remind myself every day that this is a job. And foremost is to create a professional environment. So I tell all the students and postdocs who work in the lab, I say, you're part of a team. And speaking of hats, I tell them, like, I can wear a friend hat. If you need to come in and really talk about you're breaking up with a partner or a family problem, like I will talk to you as a friend, right? And then I'll take that hat off and I'll put on my professor and mentor hat or professional hat. And then we can talk about what needs to get done and how those two are related. But it is not my place as your professor to tell you what to do with your personal life, right? What I can do is give you guidance and ideas on your professional life. And I'm willing to hear about your personal life, but we draw a sharp line. And I even tell everyone in the lab, like, I am not your friend until the day you graduate. And for your amusement and that of your viewers and listeners, I make a point of taking graduates from the lab out to lunch after they've left the lab and gossiping. And the reason I do it is because it's a clear demarcation. I'm like, you are no longer in the lab. And now I'll tell you about all the silly things and all the gossip and all the dirt that you were curious about that I refuse to tell you because it's not your business. And of course, it's not everything. But at the end of the day, I try to make a real clear distinction between this is a job. I have to be professional. I'm here to mentor you. And I have to learn the skills, Frank, to your question, that it takes to do this job well. So I have to learn about accounting, and I have to learn about why things work the way they do. A lot of professors just dump all over the university and say, oh my God, you guys and your money. Well, especially at Harvard, they're like, they got all these billions. How come they don't share it? Well, first off, that is a good question and a fair one. But most faculty don't understand how endowments work. So when you learn about endowments and IRS policy and federal law, you realize that it's not a pot of gold, and Harvard doesn't guard it like a dragon, but they have designations and they can only spend so much. So I'm going to stop there because there's many examples of how we can go wrong in this career if we think of it, if we sort of tie it up with self-worth and discovery. But it is a job. It's I think, a great job. But you have to learn the skills like you do in any other job.
Yeah, what I think is interesting about this, Pete, is and again, it's for if you're kind of talking to people that are thinking, oh, I want to be a professor someday. Nobody talks about what you just talked about. And in fact, when you go through grad school and if you do a postdoc, it's really kind of, to Frank's earlier points, it's about doing research, and you want to get published in Science or Nature, and hopefully that'll get your foot in the door for an interview. But all these, I don't even know if I'm using the right term, but these soft skills, like leadership skills, like you're talking about, that's what I find very interesting, because it's there's no training for that. It's kind of like you're thrown to the wolves and you have to do it. So it kind of, when you describe that, it kind of made me right away think about just do you think that certain like personality traits or just different demeanors may be set up to succeed better in an environment like that? Because just speaking for myself, I think that I could easily see myself struggling in a situation where you might need to be a little bit more proactive. You might need to be vocal and say, this is what I need. And it may be either intimidating, or you feel like you're not able to kind of ask for this. Like I could just imagine that there's a lot of things that are difficult, a lot of difficult waters to navigate there. And so I could see where you just seem very easy to talk to. It seems like you can kind of probably go up to anybody and ask them a question, and that that's not always easy for people to do. And so
yeah, I mean, honestly, Jay, it wasn't always the case. I'm not exaggerating. I mean, I'm pretty sure the least popular person in high school. And what I mean by that is that for my freshman and sophomore year, I'm quite certain if least popular means you have zero popularity and then there's a negative number, meaning you're like actively disliked, it is no exaggeration to say that I was on that edge.
Interesting.
But I want to share something, Jay, that is true. And that is, there was a high school student and a high school teacher who both really had my back. And I'm going to make this short and straight to your point here. But both of them made it clear to me that, this popularity and all this notions of who likes whom, they're like, that's all smoke and mirrors. And the more comfortable you get with just asking the questions that are on your mind, the more that people will eventually come to respect that. And this high school student, right? A guy named, actually two guys, both of them named Dave, and they were both musicians. And they literally said to me, we're going to make you popular in one semester. And I was like, oh my God, these guys,
like a movie.
They're going to make an ass out of me. I was like convinced. I'm like, this sophomore, they're, juniors and everybody likes them. And they were right. They were right. They did it. They just brought me to parties and events and just asserted that I was cool.
Huh.
Interesting, right, Jay? Right, Frank? Like, so how does that relate to what you were saying? I think that I learned at that moment, and I continue to learn, Jay, that if I create an atmosphere of openness, and you, Jay, were saying you weren't so sure if, you would struggle maybe doing this or being in this. I would say that this is a learned skill.
Yeah.
And I would say that there are natural aptitudes that make me really effective as a scientist in some ways. And some of my natural skills work very much against me as a scientist. And so I think our job as professionals, that's the word again, is to stop and to look and say, okay, well, how can I be most effective in my job? How do I bolster my shortcomings? How do I lean on my coworkers? Remember I mentioned those folks who helped me run the lab? Yeah. I'm very clear. And I'm like, you guys are actually better at this than I am. And that's okay.
I'd like to probe a little deeper on that, Pete. I mean, I think it's important to get specific about what traits you think have made you successful. And so I'm going to use the word successful. You're successful at your job. I'm 100% certain on that. And for a number of different reasons. I mean, you're a phenomenal thinker. You know the technical details really well. But I think, at least from my vantage point, I think you're successful because you're a good communicator, and particularly so in speaking to people, making them feel comfortable when you speak to them, and getting to points that are presented clearly and also in an interesting way. And I don't know if you've ever thought like deeply about that attribute of yourself, but I think it's a very powerful one. And it's also one that I think extrapolates across careers, at least from what I've seen. There's a certain degree of technical proficiency that will get you so far. And then there's another layer of being able to communicate your thoughts, your ideas in a persuasive and compelling, but also a simple way that I think is really, really useful, regardless of what field you're in. So have you thought about that, or have you actively tried to develop that component? I mean, some of it just comes from doing it a lot, right?
Yes.
But
yeah,
what you said is true. It's going to be undervalued.
100% agreed. Actually, everything you said is true. And one is, I think that science is just as human an endeavor as anything else. And one of the mistakes, and I will call it a mistake, that I see colleagues make is there's a kind of almost like self-righteousness about science. Like, well, we scientists are in pursuit of the truth. I'm like, well, yeah, but so are spiritual leaders. And, so is just about everybody, right? At the end of the day.
So is a lawyer, right? Yeah.
So is a lawyer. Well said. And so I think it's just, we have to acknowledge right away that science is a human endeavor, and humans learn and listen and communicate through different ways. And I have never, so I'm going to be really plain with you here. Like, I have never thought of myself, nor have I ever been called like, oh my God, Pete is like so handsome or charming or any of that. Like, that never worked for me, to be blunt. And whereas for some of my friends, they had a certain kind of almost like real, I don't know, charisma, that anything that came out of their mouth sounded like it was important. And as a younger person, I was like, oh my God, how do they do that? But to be honest with you, I started paying attention to characters that I really admired. And really one of the first ones, and this is such a nerdy thing to say, but was Star Trek Next Generation, was Captain Picard. And it sounds so nerdy. I mean, I can even see you laughing. I mean, it's totally nerdy. Like, let's just call it what it is. But I think I was really drawn to this idea of this person who was not like Captain Kirk, someone that I considered, like, I had no familiarity with that. But I'm like, here's this like balding dude, which by the way was not me. I had hair as a younger man, but still, I'm like, here's this balding dude. He's a little uptight. He's, but he's communicative. Like, he's able to talk. And I always thought that was really a neat character. And it made me think that maybe I should just figure out how I can share my ideas in a way that different kinds of people can connect with. So I actively, Frank, very actively pay attention to how people respond to the words I say.
It's a wonderful trait. I mean, you do really well at it. I think there are certain people you can always just listen to, like you and Paul Giamatti. I could probably always listen to, no matter what they say.
Oh wow, big shoes.
So can I ask about
go
that?
ahead, Jim. Yeah.
So Pete, do you feel like you're a natural when it comes to this, or can you maybe give an example of what you've done to hone your craft? That's interesting to me.
No, absolutely, Jay. I would say that hone is, I'm leaning more towards hone. Now, it's hard for me, honestly, to assess what is or isn't natural. I mean, I was born with a deep voice. That helps. But it does. Like, I just acknowledge these things matter. It's like George Washington being elected first president. He was always going to be some position of authority because he was the tallest person in the room. Like, there are just some things that humans do, and deep voices help. But Jay, this is a honed craft, and I have never been comfortable with public performance, like, ever.
Yeah.
I mean, again, going back to high school and college and even grad school, giving talks, if I were doing this then, I would be sweating. But then I meet people, Jay, who are good at performers. mention Andrea Unzueta Martinez in my lab now. She's Colombian, and she's a very bright postdoctoral scholar. Um, but she also began her life as a professional dancer. And it's unnerving for me to be around her in a setting where she dances because she is really good. And like, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm just like, where do you conjure all of that energy? I don't know. I'm a terrible dancer. But so I proactively ask her, I'm like, how do you get in the mindset of dancing? And why are you so good and I'm so bad?
Yeah.
And she's correct when she said, part of the reason you're so bad is because you think you're so bad.
Right.
So the very first thing you got to do is put that in the trash and then be really genuine and curious about like, okay, how does that move work? And I guess, Jay, that's the best answer I can give you is to just recognize that, get out of your own way and then ask people like, how do you sound like that? Like, what little tricks do you employ? What's the pattern? What's the method?
Yeah, the analogy it's cliche, but I like the sports analogy about how the best players aren't always the best coaches and vice versa. And it's very interesting how, some people can teach a skill and some people can perform a skill, and trying to connect, like, how do you connect those? So it's just,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So Pete, I think it'd be great to know, now that we've talked a little bit about the different dimensions of your job, how did you get into this? Like, how did you get your foot in the door at this job? What as a little Pete led you down this path, and what steps were in making progress on this path?
Well, I like to start, as I think it must, with my parents, both of whom were immigrants from Egypt. They came from a really small rural town. My mom was an electrical engineer in Egypt, the only woman in her class, and my dad was a biochemist, an agricultural biochemist. They got married in 1969, immigrated here. I was born a few years later, and they moved to Los Angeles for my mom. It was a time where our family was on some food stamps. We didn't have a lot of money, but my parents worked hard, and I want to tell you, they were fiercely appreciative and patriotic to this country. So in this moment where we keep talking a lot about immigrants, to me, it's very dissonant because so many immigrants I know, would like fall on their own sword for the United States for the opportunities they've had here. And my parents were among them. Now, my mom ended up being an aerospace engineer at Hughes Aircraft, and she worked on designing missiles and forward-looking infrared radar systems for F-16 fighter jets, for all you nerds out there. And it was weird growing up because my mom was into all of this military defense stuff, but we grew up in an aerospace town where they built the Apollo rockets and the space shuttle. It was a prime contractor, right? So lots of people build little pieces. They all converge on my town. They get assembled and trained out to Cape Canaveral. And so my weekends were spent sort of driving to the surplus yard with a little buddy, kind of my one and only friend as a kid, because I was very awkward. And we would go and we would buy bits of spaceships. And I still have some of them today. Like, this is what I thought every kid did. I think that instilled in me a real love and appreciation of exploration. And I was an anxious kid. I grew up between two cultures. I grew up with a very traditional Middle Eastern father who had a big temper and a big voice, and I was just not in a good place. But in that little town, whenever there were fights between African Americans and Irish Americans, all the usual stuff we're dealing with today, I clearly remember people saying, y'all need to put those aside. Here we are in Los Angeles. You all need to put those aside because we have to beat the Soviets. There's a bigger cause. Like, we have to look out for our well-being. Now, I'm glad the Cold War is over, but you can see the slight appeal of having something that brought us together. So first and foremost, that explains the exploration part. But I had no idea I loved marine science. I went to UCLA. I thought I'd be an eye doctor because my parents wanted me to be an eye doctor. I hated pre-med, so I ditched it. I studied Italian history for a couple of years and took art classes and all this. And then I took oceanography, and I was just like, boom. And Star Trek: The Next Generation was on. And so I'm not making it up. It sounds embarrassing to say, but here's this TV show where they're exploring, and I'm like, I could do this in the ocean, and maybe I could be sort of Picardish at some point in my life. Like he pulled it off. He seems like a dork too. So I don't know, folks. It was some combination of that brought it all together.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, sometimes it's really hard to track back those events that led you
Yeah.
down the path. I know it is for me. Like I
Yeah.
can't look clearly back and see the steps that brought me into ocean science or really even into science. I do think part of it had to do with the fact that I grew up in the desert and I went to the coast once or twice as a kid, and it was just like this dynamically different world,
Mm.
like this incredible contrast. And I
Yeah.
think that contrast cemented itself into my head, and I just wanted something different and wanted to get to know that something different. And I
Well,
think that's not such a dissimilar.
no, no, but I am curious to ask both of you something because I think this is true for me. Um, Sometimes when people I get asked like, "What's your secret to success or happiness or whatever?" Um, I I feel compelled to say like a little bit of audacity. Or a little bit of blind faith. I don't know what the right phrase, if either of those is exactly right, but kind of like you, Frank, I was like, okay, well, I'm about to wrap up undergraduate and I don't know, maybe I'll get a PhD. I mean, really, I had no big life plan for any of this. By the time I finished my doctorate degree, I was convinced like what I wanted was a job at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, which is a wonderful master's degree granting institution in California in the Central Coast. That was my dream job. I wanted a job there, and I wanted to raise goats, and I wanted to have a boat and go diving. Like I said, that is what I wanted. And ironically, it's the one thing I have yet to achieve, as hard as I've tried. Um, but I don't know, like an opportunity would pop up, and I'd be like, okay, why not? I'll go to Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. Sure, sounds fun.
I mean, I think that's not uncommon at all. I mean, I think Jay
Yeah,
has similar experiences. So many people do, and it's not just scientists, right? I
right.
think we all have these kind of pieces that fall into place around us that create
Yeah,
this kind of path forward. Some of those pieces are provided by our parents or, the social circumstances that we live in or the geography that we live in. And we all just kind of take what's the easiest next step forward without giving it too much thought. Some people do. Some people have plans and goals. I certainly didn't. But I think one of the goals of just talking about this and the goals of this podcast is to put the options out there. I mean, there are so many careers that I
right.
never considered as a kid. I wasn't exposed to them. My parents didn't expose me to them. And certainly society at that time didn't have as much information flow as it does now. So I just didn't see the options out there. And I never had somebody talk to me about what the potential could be. And that's the goal of this. And I think it's telling that you and me kind of took the easy, not easy next steps necessarily, but the next steps. And Jay, that's probably true for you as well.
Yeah, and if you don't mind me asking, Pete, when you said you kind of ditched the pre-med route, was there because I can imagine depending on how things were with your family, that could take a lot of courage. Were your parents supportive of that, or was that an issue?
That was an issue. Yeah,
Yeah.
I pretty much sucked. But I
And-
got an F in chemistry at UCLA. I almost feel like saying don't tell anyone, but I'm past the embarrassment now, I think. But I failed chemistry. I got a C minus in OChem. I hated OChem so much that I took my OChem book out into an empty field and shot it.
Yeah.
That is how much I hated that class. I hated the students. I got sick for a week and a half with a nasty bug, and nobody would share their notes. Everything related and that touched on pre-med did not go well. And my parents were like, stick it out, stick it out. But I'm like, I hate this.
Yeah, I think that. So you're touching on two things that I find very interesting. I do think that level of that courage, like not everybody can tap into that. So I think one that's great. I think there's a lot of people are people pleasers and they'll just kind of go along with, oh, I got to do. And then the other thing too is just adversity in general. I do think, and maybe my perception of this is wrong, but I do think, especially for professors, it kind of selects for like the very highest achieving academics. So it's almost like you run the risk of perfectionists that get pulled into that field that they ace every exam, they never get anything
Yeah.
wrong,
Yeah.
and then it breeds like a fear of failure. And so if you have those struggles earlier on, it almost makes you better equipped later on, because inevitably something's got to give, so that's just
Jay,
that it could be a blessing for you, you know what I mean, like that you had those struggles, and it can help you on.
Jay, I think that's brilliant, actually. I think it is really insightful, and I could not emphasize that enough. I mean, um, failure is inevitable, as you note, and I think I can point to my failures as um, key to helping me make my way to this place. I clearly remember several times as an undergraduate sitting there on my balcony thinking, well, good luck, looking at my report card or whatever the hell they called it, then transcript, and thinking, God, I got an F. I got an F. I got a C minus. Like, what made me even think I could, graduate from UCLA, let alone graduate and be a doctor? And I just remember thinking, feeling sick to my stomach. And then I decided, you know what? I mean, I feel like I've hit rock bottom, right? So, like, the worst case scenario is already here.
Yep.
And so if it's already here, I mean, I guess I could stop, but then it still hurts. So I don't know. I might as well just be radical and try something different. But it wasn't some bravery, Jay. It wasn't like a preconceived sense of like, I'm going to fight. Like no, but it was a decision that I don't have there's no way this could get worse.
I see.
And thus I was like, all right, well, I might as well try Italian history. I mean, what am I going to do? Fail?
Yeah. So there's some liberation there for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well said. And I think I've learned not to be afraid of failure. Don't get me wrong, I got plenty of fears, folks. Like, there are things that do give me a great deal of anxiety. And a lot of my anxieties as a kid are still there. I can manage them a little better. But for the most part, I manage the kind of fears that people have about their careers by just saying, okay, like, I have failed before, but if I fail kind of on my terms, meaning I've done the best work that I can,
Right.
and I'm really just doing the best for everyone in my life that I can, then it's okay. It's going to be okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think failure is critical, and we all go through it. And my wife does a really good job of reminding me that every negative experience can also be a positive experience if you learn something from it. And I think that that's essentially what you're describing. And you made the point earlier that however, at the end of the day, are talking about is essentially a job, right? And many people will want to know a little bit about the stability of that job, the financial viability of that job. And I think it's important to address that, especially for folks that are considering getting into these careers. And we should probably preface this by saying we're kind of talking about academic scientists. There are many, many other dimensions of science and many, many other dimensions of marine biology, which we haven't really talked about, but we're talking about academics. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about, one, the stability of your job and how you feel about it, and two, like, can you make a living off of it?
I think that we as academics do a rather poor job of talking with earlier career colleagues about what our lives are actually like and what our, frankly, history has actually been like. And I don't know that I have a perfect, or even, I'm going to drop the word perfect, I don't know that I have my most effective kind of analogy developed yet. I keep looking for some way to explain the academic career trajectory that's, an analogy or a metaphor, something understandable. I don't know if I have one. What I do tell people, though, is that I think of being a scientist as being a practitioner of science, and that means that Jay and you and I are all scientists. It also means that the two doctoral students who graduated from my lab and are now patent attorneys are scientists, in that they are in patent law and they leverage their science as attorneys, right? So they are still, to a degree, practicing their science. People who earn their doctorate degrees and go off to teach in high school are still practitioners of that science. And I try and say, as you apply for jobs, I strongly encourage students. I'm like, don't think about applying for a perfect job. Think of the opportunity before you as applying for a number of jobs that appeal to you. And the best outcome is you're offered more than one and you get to pick one. But if you are offered one that you're happy with, just remember that that's a good place to be. And it is the beginning of your career, not the end. And there are very few doors that permanently close, right? People freak out like, oh my gosh, if I go into industry for a year, I'll never be in academia again. I'm like, hogwash. Now, it's also true, though, if you go into industry for 15 years, chances are you're not going to end up back in the academy. But that's kind of practical, too. You've developed a different skill set. But when people are early in their careers looking at all these sort of different kinds of jobs, I'm like, they're probably less different than you may realize in some fundamental ways. And we don't talk enough about that.
I agree completely, Pete. But I do think that these are conversations that need to start sooner rather than later. I see so many students that kind of blindly or semi-blindly enter a graduate school without really thinking about it, the viability, and really thinking about those career decisions that come next.
Yeah.
Some are, many aren't. And it is a profession like many other that can reward you if you work hard.
Right.
But can also spit you out a little bit if things don't
100%.
fall your way.
Yeah, just a real quick comment on this. A lot of folks in my life, or my earlier career colleagues, the students in the lab and the like, over the last few years, many of them are like, I don't want your job, Pete. Your job blows. I'm like, well, now wait a minute. And I've had to sit down with folks and back them away from the cliff a bit. Recently there was a postdoc who worked with me for 11 years, not as a postdoc. She was a grad student and a postdoc, landed this great job in Boston. She really struggled in those last few years in my lab for a lot of very personal reasons, all of which are just legitimate. Just life happens. And she got this job and she came back and hung out with us. And she's like, my job's the best. I get paid so much money and I get to leave it all, in the office Friday at 5 p.m. Like, it's the best. I made this the best decision I ever made to get out of academia. I feel like academia is wrong and it's broken, and everybody bandwagoned on this. And a younger version of me would have just picked a fight and been like, that's not fair. But, I tried to sit back and say, okay, right, we're just going to sit with this for a while. And then a few weeks later, as I caught up with her again, she's like, office politics are weird. Like, there are these two factions and they're fighting. And she's like, I don't really know. And I kind of miss this. I'm like, yes, because at the end of the day, all of these jobs have their pros and cons. And I really want to encourage any listeners here or viewers to, like, be a little quantitative if you can about this, and certainly a little semi-quantitative or whatever that means. But I tell people, like, if, as a Harvard employee, right, I get a paycheck. I could probably make double what I make now in industry. But let's also acknowledge that I also have the opportunity to write grants to do something I chose to do, right, for the equivalent of 25% of my pay. So with a little bit of extra work, I actually can make 25% more money to do something that I exactly have picked. And then on top of that, Harvard contributes better to my retirement by far than most businesses. And actually many academic institutions do contribute pretty well. At least we can point to it as something that is, they do their best. And often, if you look at it, most financial planners will say that's a really good plan. Then health insurance, and it goes on and on. And the fact that I can take my kids for 6 weeks on a cross-country road trip without asking anyone. So I just think it's important to be really honest with ourselves about the pros and cons for ourselves. Jay, for you, you may be in the best place that you could possibly be for you, bud. And it's not my place to judge it and tell you otherwise, right?
Right.
But there may have been a point earlier, Jay, where you ended up in as an academic, and in that case, it would have been a different best version of you.
Right.
No, I agree with that. Universities are organizations, and companies are organizations. Governments are organizations. many of them operate very similarly once you get into them. You're always going to be dealing with the complexities of social dynamics. You're always going to be dealing with, to some extent, bureaucracy and regulations. These are just intrinsic properties of complex organizations. You're not going to get away from that. At the end of the day, I think one of the really beautiful things about working as a professor in academics is the nature of the people that you're around. And I tell my students this all of the time. Like, I get to be around you guys. You guys are awesome. Like, you're all smarter than me. You're all more open-minded than me. You do more than I do or ever could do. And these are just some of the people that could be successful in any profession, yet they've chosen a profession where they try to understand how the world works using evidence. And I think that that's really just beautiful. And it's not something that you see everywhere. And I try to remind myself of that on a daily basis. I think that's one of the real perks of the trade.
Yeah. I agree, Frank. And Jay, one thing I wanted to share with you and Frank, but leaning a bit towards you, Jay, is that I also think that sometimes we create we don't work to break down barriers between different sectors. And I think academia and industry have opportunities to really engage. And I don't just mean, for new discovery and the like. I mean, we know that happens and there's all these agreements. I don't know, but I'm also saying, Jay, like, I think it would be really fantastic if you're game, for you to spend some time with the microbiology students on campus who are really interested in learning about what a career outside academia might be like.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously part of my reason for kind of joining Frank on this mission is selfish. There's certain things that I hope to gain from this. Like, I think that there's just a lot to learn. I do think the points that you all were making earlier about just, it really kind of comes down to like gratitude, just thinking about, because every job has its issues.
Right.
And just thinking about what it is that really appeals to you and can really, and again, I'm kind of stuck on that growth mindset thing. So yeah, anything, Pete, like, it's definitely pushing me outside my comfort zone. I'm not full disclosure. I'm not the type to say, hey, Pete, why don't I come down there and talk to students that I don't know about life in industry and vice versa. But I don't know, just going through this, like, I enjoy it. There is a part of me that enjoys it. So maybe I need to kind of harness my younger Pete and just kind of throw caution a little bit and just kind of go for that. But yeah.
But see, the beauty is, Jay, is that it doesn't have to be putting you on a stage in front of 50 people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So if you're comfortable talking with 3 or 4 folks over a cup of coffee, I mean, I think it would be wonderful. And maybe there's something for all of us that would come out of that. I suspect there would be.
Yeah, it'd be fun.
All right. You're on. I know where to find you.
Okay. Sounds good.
Well, Pete, this has been wonderful. I think that, another motivation for this series is that I think both Jay and I really love hearing from people that love what they do and know a lot about what they do and are willing to share it with us. And I think we both really appreciate your time tonight. And full disclosure as well, I will probably bug you again to do this. I think there are many dimensions that we didn't really even get to. Like, we didn't talk about marine biology, which is fine. That's well, we can do that at another time. And I also know where to find you.
Indeed.
So with that, I think we'll just call it quits for tonight. And thank you again, Pete. It was wonderful to see you. Jay, wonderful to see you as well.
Pleasure is mine. Gentlemen, I would be more than happy to be back. And one thing that, if I may put a kind of a plant in for an idea, is I think it would be amazing to talk about how, frankly, for the 3 of us, skills and experiences from parts of our life that how they shaped what we do, and like, we would never have expected that to be the case. Like, that could be really fun.
Yeah, those wonderful surprise learning experiences. Awesome. I love it.
Thanks, folks.
Yeah,
Great
thank
seeing
you
you guys.
guys. Thank you.